There is a version of the military that has no flag, no uniform code, no court-martial, and no obligation to bring you home in a body bag with honors. It doesn't answer to Congress. It doesn't answer to the Geneva Convention. It answers to one thing only: the contract. This is Blackwater. And if you think working for them sounds like a blockbuster action movie, you're half right. The other half is something Hollywood would never greenlight, because nobody would believe it. Blackwater USA was founded in 1997 by Eric Prince, a former Navy SEAL with a family fortune, a political network, and an idea that would change warfare forever. The idea was simple and terrifying. What if you could build a private army, hire it out to the highest bidder, and operate in the gaps where governments needed plausible deniability? Iraq would make Blackwater a household name. It would also nearly destroy it. But before we get to the top, we start where everyone starts, at the bottom. Because the bottom of Blackwater is unlike the bottom of anything else you've ever heard of. To even be considered as a Blackwater recruit in its prime years, you needed one thing above all else: a trigger you'd already pulled. Blackwater didn't hire civilians and train them from scratch. They hired veterans, ex-law enforcement, former special operators, men who had already been through the machine of a nation-state military and come out the other side either too aggressive, too broken, or simply too addicted to the lifestyle to go back to a desk job in Ohio. The average Blackwater contractor in Iraq was in his early 30s, had done multiple combat tours, and was now being offered 3 to 6 times his military salary to do essentially the same job, except this time with fewer restrictions and significantly more cash. $600 a day. Some contracts pushed past 1,000. In 2004, that was more than what a US Army specialist made in a month. You signed a contract, not an oath. That distinction matters more than you can possibly imagine. Your first weeks as a fresh recruit feel less like onboarding and more like being thrown into a river to see if you swim. There's no boot camp. There's no hand-holding. You arrive in Baghdad or Kabul or wherever the contract points, and you are immediately surrounded by men who have seen things that restructured their relationship with human life. You are handed your weapon, handed your rules of engagement, which are notably thinner than anything the US military operates under, and you are put to work. The work at the lowest level is protection. You are a body between a principal and a bullet. That principal might be a State Department official. It might be a CIA case officer. It might be a reconstruction contractor who needs to drive through Fallujah to inspect a building. Your job is to make sure they arrive and return. Simple in theory. In practice, every road is a potential kill zone, and every car that drives too close is a decision you have to make in under 2 seconds. As a door kicker, the informal term for the lowest operational tier of Blackwater's combat role contractors, you exist in a state of permanent, low-grade adrenaline. You wake up in a fortified compound. You eat, you brief, you load your weapons, and you go outside the wire into a city that wants you dead, not because of who you are, but because of what you represent. And what you represent is complicated even to yourself. You're not a soldier. You have no military rank. If you're captured, the US government will issue a careful statement about how you were a private citizen. You are simultaneously more powerful than almost anyone on that street, heavily armed, well-trained, operating in a vehicle that could survive a direct hit, and completely expendable at the institutional level. The company will pay your family if you die. That's in the contract. But there will be no folded flag, no 21-gun salute, no memorial at Arlington. The Triggerman tier is where things get philosophically dark in ways that most people never have to reckon with. By the time you reach this level, You've been in country long enough to have internalized the rhythm of the work. You've stopped flinching at certain sounds. You've made decisions on the street that you've had to file away somewhere deep and inaccessible if you want to keep functioning. The rules of engagement for Blackwater contractors in Iraq during the peak years were genuinely different from those governing US military personnel. This wasn't a secret. It was the point. Contractors could use force more liberally. They weren't subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Iraqi law, until a 2009 Status of Forces Agreement renegotiation, largely couldn't touch them either. This created an environment where decisions that would result in courts-martial for a soldier could be made by a contractor with minimal consequence. Most contractors never abused this, but some did, and the system was structured in a way that made abuse not just possible, but in certain high-pressure environments, almost inevitable. September 16th, 2007. Nisur Square, Baghdad. A Blackwater convoy opens fire in a crowded traffic circle. 17 Iraqi civilians are killed. The contractors involved claimed they were responding to a threat. Iraqi witnesses, the Iraqi government, and a subsequent FBI investigation told a different story. The incident became the defining moment, not just for Blackwater, but for the entire private, military, contractor industry. It forced a reckoning with a question that nobody in Washington had wanted to ask too loudly. What happens when you build an army that operates outside the normal frameworks of accountability, and then that army does something that can't be ignored? The answer, it turned out, was complicated legal proceedings, a corporate rebrand, and no serious structural change to how the industry operated. But for the men at the bottom of that hierarchy, the door kickers and trigger men who were on the ground in Nisor Square and 100 places like it, the reckoning was more personal. Because you can rebrand a company, you cannot rebrand what you carry home inside you. By the time you reach team member status, you've been through enough that the job has become identity. You don't just work for Blackwater, you are Blackwater. In the same way, a Marine is a Marine even after he takes off the uniform. The brotherhood among contractors is real and intense, forged under conditions that most people will never experience. You know the man next to you will die for you because you've already seen him nearly do it. You share a particular kind of dark humor that serves as both bonding mechanism and psychological pressure valve. You have opinions about weapons, about tactics, about the specific incompetence of certain State Department officials who made your job harder than it needed to be. You are exceptionally good at what you do, and what you do exists in a moral gray zone, so wide and so deliberately constructed that entire academic careers have been spent trying to map its edges. You live in that gray zone. You've stopped asking whether the zone should exist. You just work. Team leader is where the gray zone becomes your management problem. You are now responsible not just for your own decisions under fire, but for the decisions of 4 to 8 men whose psychological states you are constantly monitoring. You run pre-mission briefs. You coordinate with military liaisons who alternately respect and your presence. You manage the slow burn of men who are very well paid, very highly skilled, and operating under conditions that erode judgment over time. You are the last human layer between the contract and the chaos. Nobody talks about the men at the top of Blackwater. Everyone knows the name Eric Prince. Everyone has an opinion about the contractors on the ground. But the layer in between, the site commanders, the regional directors, the corporate operators, who turned a security firm into a shadow government with guns. That layer is where the real story lives, because the men at the bottom pulled triggers. The men at the top pulled strings, and string pulling, it turns out, leaves far fewer marks. By the time you reach site commander, you have crossed a threshold that most people in this industry never cross. You are no longer a weapon. You are the person who decides where the weapons point. A site commander in Blackwater's operational peak was responsible for an entire theater of operations, a country, a region, sometimes a specific high-value installation that the US government needed secured but couldn't officially touch. You managed dozens of contractors, multiple simultaneous protection details, logistics chains that ran through 3 countries, and a budget that would make a small city mayor dizzy. You woke up every morning with a map in your head and threat assessments from the night before. And your job was to keep every moving piece of a very expensive, very dangerous machine from flying apart. The pay reflected this. Site commanders at Peak Blackwater were clearing annual compensation that put them firmly in the bracket of senior corporate executives. Except corporate executives don't get their salary docked when one of their employees gets shot. The relationship between a site commander and the US government entities he worked alongside was one of the most quietly complex dynamics in the entire war on terror ecosystem. Officially, you were a contractor, a vendor, a service provider operating under a State Department or DOD contract. Unofficially, you often knew more about what was happening on the ground in your region than the military officers nominally in charge of it. You had been there longer, your people had deeper local networks, you operated with fewer bureaucratic constraints, which meant you could move faster, adapt quicker, and make decisions that the official chain of command would have taken 3 days and 4 approval signatures to authorize. Military commanders respected this and resented it in equal measure. Some of them leaned on you heavily, treating your operation as an extension of their own. Others kept you at arm's length, uncomfortable with the ambiguity of what you represented. You learned to navigate both types. You had to. The contract depended on it. Regional director is where the soldier disappears entirely and the businessman takes over. By this level, you are no longer in the field in any operational sense. You are in offices, in Washington, in London, in Abu Dhabi, sitting across tables from government officials and defense ministry representatives and intelligence community liaisons, negotiating contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You speak the language of threat assessment and force projection and operational capacity, but you speak it now in boardroom cadences, with PowerPoint slides and liability frameworks and carefully worded clauses about indemnification. You have exchanged your body armor for a suit, and a suit is a different kind of armor, one that protects you from congressional oversight committees and DOJ investigators and the journalists who have been trying to get to your level for years. At regional director, you see the full architecture of what Blackwater actually built. It was not simply a security company. It was a parallel infrastructure for American foreign policy in places where American foreign policy needed to happen without American fingerprints. Need to train a foreign intelligence service in interrogation techniques? There's a contract for that. Need to move a high-value detainee between facilities in a way that doesn't appear in any official transfer log. There's a contractor for that too. Need armed overwatch on a CI operation in a country where the US is not officially operating. You know the number to call. Blackwater and its competitors filled every gap that the official apparatus either couldn't fill or didn't want its name attached to. The regional directors were the people who designed those gaps, priced them, and delivered them on schedule. The corporate operator tier is where the story becomes almost surreal in its brazenness. After Nisur Square, after the congressional hearings, after the FBI investigation, and the avalanche of bad press that would have buried most companies, Blackwater did something that only an organization with sufficiently powerful friends could do. It rebranded. In 2009, the company changed its name to Zay Services. In 2011, it became Academy. The logos changed. The website changed. The public-facing narrative changed. The contracts did not change. The clients did not change. The fundamental business model, providing armed men to do the things governments needed done without official attribution, did not change by a single degree. The corporate rebrand was not a reform. It was a lesson in how power insulates itself. A lesson that the corporate operators at this level had internalized completely, because they were the ones who executed it. Operating at this tier means you have developed a very particular skill set that has nothing to do with weapons or tactics or threat assessment. You are an expert in the architecture of accountability, specifically in how to build organizations that can absorb scandal, shed liability, and continue operating. You understand how to structure contracts so that responsibility is diffuse. You understand how to position subsidiaries so that legal exposure in one jurisdiction doesn't contaminate the parent entity. You understand which congressional relationships need to be maintained, which think tanks need to be funded, which former generals need to be on the advisory board so that when the next congressional hearing happens, there are enough friendly voices in the room. This is not corruption in the crude sense. It is something more sophisticated and more durable. The systemic embedding of a private military interest into the permanent architecture of American national security policy. And then there is Eric Prince, former Navy SEAL, heir to a Michigan auto parts fortune, founder of Blackwater at 32 years old. The man who looked at the post-Cold War security landscape and saw not a world getting safer, but a market getting larger. Prince's genius, if you want to call it that, was not tactical or operational. It was structural. He understood before almost anyone else that the combination of an overstretched US military, a government increasingly comfortable with outsourcing, and a post-9/11 blank check for anything labeled counter-terrorism created a historic opening. He built an organization to fill that opening, and he built it fast. And by the time anyone in Washington was asking hard questions about what exactly they had enabled, Blackwater was too embedded, too necessary, and too politically connected to be dismantled. Prince testified before Congress. He weathered investigations. He watched 4 of his contractors get charged for Nassau Square, charges that were later vacated, reinstated, and ground through years of appeals. He sold Blackwater in 2010, walked away with his fortune intact, and proceeded to continue doing more or less the same work through different vehicles in different jurisdictions. He pitched a private Afghan strategy to the Trump administration. He built training infrastructure in China. He explored contracts in Libya and Ukraine and a dozen other places where the gap between what governments needed and what they could officially do remained wide open and profitable. No prison, no serious consequence. A net worth estimated in the hundreds of millions, and a career that by any honest accounting reshaped how modern warfare is financed, staffed, and deliberately obscured from public view. That is what the top of this hierarchy looks like. Not glory, not honor, not even notoriety, really, because the most successful people at the top of Blackwater are names you have never heard, operating through entities you cannot find on contracts that do not appear in any public record. The men at the bottom carried the weight of the work in their bodies and their sleep. The men at the top carried it in their portfolios, and the portfolios, unlike the bodies, are doing just fine